Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to implement the API service with the same manner that we have done under the Kotlin application. Under util, a new folder, I'm going to call it API. Start by creating a new class, which is API service. And for this particular class, how to make API calls, we're going to use URL session. It's predefined under Swift. So there is no needed dependency or to add another library to do so. And let's call it API service. I will create here a function that's going to be solely for making the request. It's going to take care of making the API calls. We need here to pass as an argument the endpoint of type string and the base URL and the data of type data. And we will add other parameters accordingly. So basically how to do API calls using URL session. First of all, we have to create a request of type URL request. And we have to pass here the URL, as simple as this. And URL is from the API endpoint and the base URL. And because we have provided the base URL as an optional parameter, we need to allow the user to use either the full URL under the endpoint itself or to provide the base URL separately from the endpoint. I'm going to create here a string URL representing the final URL. We can take the base URL if it's not null. And if it's null, what we have to do here is to use the base URL from the function or the class itself. All right. I'm going to add here a private let base URL. While we do this, I want to add a builder class for this API service as the thing that we have done under Kotlin. I'm a huge fan of builder pattern. Let's add the initializer. The string URL could be from the make request function, or it could be from self and base URL. And this value again is nullable. Therefore, we have to add here an empty string for a fallback. And we have to add here, or to concatenate here, the endpoint from the make request function. Now we have to create the URL. To create the URL is very simple. We have to use the URL class, and we have to provide as an argument the string URL. And because creating a URL can result in a nullable value, we're going to add here a guard. Let's call it URL. From using URL class, and we have to provide here the string, and the string basically is the string URL. If it's null, I prefer to throw an error. I'm going to add here basically a to-do. I'm going to pass it here as an argument. Now we have the request. We can customize this request by defining, for example, the HTTP method. And as I said before, this is a good approach. Abstracts things under core application in order to be used in different projects. As a freelancer, this is very handy if you are on a deadline and you don't want to reinvent the wheel. I'm going to create here an internal enumeration, HTTP request method, get method, post for this particular tutorial, and the last case, put, and let's add here an argument method of type HTTP request method. Here we're going to do method raw value. At the end, we're going to return request, add here parentheses. And for the return type of this particular function, it is an async function, and it should give us a return type of type data. I would like to add here the timeout for the request as an option for this API service. Next, we need to add the application header or the default header for this request. We are dealing with JSON, so I'm going to do here application JSON by default. For the header field, we'll assign here accept. Keep in mind, we are always defining the request or constructing the request. If the method is put or post, therefore we have to assign here a form data. Otherwise, it's going to be a normal GET request. We don't need actually the form data. Put, and the other one, post. We need to deal with the form data. First of all, I'm going to create here a body data, which is basically the form data. Data is the parameter that we have assigned here, all right? Because it's nullable, that's why we have done this if statement. If it's not null, we're going to do request, and we're going to add the HTTP body data from the data. Next, we're going to do here request. We have to set the application, which is application JSON. And for the HTTP header field, it has to be here the content type. If you do remember, we need to attach the viewer token. And this class should be used for multiple cases. More specifically, this make request should be used under multiple scenarios. Headers, it is basically a map. So we have to add here the headers as I said before. And for each entry, we're going to do request, and we have to add simply the value from the request by doing value. And for HTTP header field, it's going to be the key itself, which is very simple. Now we can use the request in order to make the API call. This whole thing can trigger an exception. Therefore, we have to use the do catch. So how to do an API call is simply we have to do try, await, and session. Of course, we have to create a reusable session, and we have to do data. Let's go up and create a session. It's going to be a private field of type URL session. Let's make it reusable. And of course, we're going to target here the builder method. This is very important, guys, because we don't have to hard code the session. It's the same analogy in Kotlin. We shouldn't hard code HTTP clients. We need to provide in normal environments the normal HTTP clients and the mock HTTP clients or the mock engine in the test environments. This is the same idea here. We don't care about whether it is the mock one or the test session or the normal session. We don't care. Just a session that has to be passed to the API service. Let's add it here under self and the session equals session. And we have to pass here the request. It's going to give us basically some data and it is a synchronous function. Therefore, we're going to add here the keyword async and perhaps going to throw an error. That's why I have done this. All right, so the function itself, make request, should give us the data. And I would like here to make this function request or the whole API service very efficient by handling two states basically, whether we are on the background thread or a foreground thread. Therefore, I'm going to add here a flag. I'm going to call it with background and let's provide here with background. Let's come back to the implementation. This is optional. You can skip this, but I try to maximize the abstraction here in the core application module. First of all, I'm going to initialize here the data that we have to return. Now, if it's with background, by calling try, await, session, and data, we have to pass here the request that you have constructed before. Now, if we are under the foreground thread, I prefer to do it with using the cancellation and response under this object by calling try, await with task cancellation handler, session, and data. And for the cancellation or on cancel, what we have to do here, we're going to use the other method, which is download task by doing let task equals session and download task and task.resume. Of course, it shouldn't be here equal. It should be of type data and request. I would like to add here a logger, if you will, for debugging purposes. If we are under the success status, we're going to do here guard let's cast this URL response. We can do here if it is between 200 and 299, which is basically a status code, contains the element which is HTTP response. And here we have to use the status code. Else, at the end, we have to return the data. Now, Xcode is going to complain about the self, which is basically refers to the session. It's like doing self and session. The session field of API service is of type URL session, and it's not sendable by default. I do not recommend remove this warning. Therefore, I'm going to conform this API service to the protocol sendable by adding here sendable, and the error is gone. Now we have here actually two stuff that we have to define. First of all, it's the API error, and second of all, the login or the logger, if you will, which is optional. I'm going to create here a new file, Swift file. I'm going to call it API error of type error. For testing purposes, I'm going to add here equitable as errors. It could be invalid URL. The user can provide an invalid URL, request failed, and we have to pass here the error, invalid response. Perhaps there is an error during decoding from the JSON response to the DTO. Therefore, I'm going to add here another case. Let's call it failed or decoding failed. I would like to specify another case only for the backend error. Sometimes we can receive no data. Encoding error, if we want to send form data, I don't know, if you haven't provided any dependencies for some reason, missing dependencies for this API service, we're going to throw this kind of error. All right, now we have to implement the equitable protocol, how to compare basically two instances of API error. Gonna add here function. It's gonna be a static function. I have to override this operator, I think, and the left side of type API error and the right side of type API error. and it has to give us a Boolean value if both sides are of type invalid URL. In this case, what we have to do, going to return true. For the second case, if the both cases are left and right are of type no data, it's going to return true. The other case, which is missing dependencies. So basically it's going to be the same thing for missing dependencies as well as invalid response and encoding failed. All the cases that they don't have a parameter, they're going to be pretty much the same thing. Pretty much going to proceed with the same manner. Now for the other cases where we have parameters, case of request failed. Basically what's going to happen here for the comparison, it will return if the left side error as the NS error, an objective C class bridged into Swift programming language, equal to right side as NS error. Likewise for the rest default section, we're going to return false. We have forgot actually here to do the backend error, Laravel backend. Therefore, I'm going to create here another class. I'm going to call it backend error. You can think of this backend error as a DTO, if you will. It's going to hold only the information of the errors from Laravel. It has only two fields. The first one, which is the error message, and another field, which is errors. A map, string of an array. If you do remember, under the validation, we have a list of messages concerning the validation. Now, we have to provide here the coding keys, and we have to provide here the constructor. That's all we have for backend error. Let's come back to the API error. And instead of error, it's going to be of type backend error. Sendable. And we need to show how those two instances, left and right, are equal. By doing case backend error, we will return error message equal right side error and error message. The next function that we have to implement is API service logger. Only one static function. Let's call it log. What do we need here basically is the request, response, the data to show the form data, for example, and the error to show the error as well. When I say here to show the error, it means that we're going to print only the error. First, we're going to print here the beginning of the log. At the end of the log, we're going to do here defer and to print this log. So we don't have to do nothing in between. You can put this print at the bottom, but this is a very fancy way to do so. I want to show this request first. The URL can be nullable, request.url. In this case, we're going to show the absolute string from the URL. I want to show the method. Let's show the headers. I'm going to print here a message like headers, and we have to loop over the headers and show the key value. Now for the body, it is request and HTTP body, and we have, this is the first one. And the second data that we can retrieve is basically, we want the body as well as the string representation of the body. In this case, we're going to show the body as a string. Now I want to show the response. And this is the section for the response. So basically here, I'm going to show the absolute string URL. Otherwise, it's going to be an unknown URL. I would like to show here after the URL, the MIME type. I would like to show the HTTP status code from response, HTTP URL response. Next, I would like to show the headers, and we have to loop over the headers. If there is no HTTP response, I'm going to print here, for example, no HTTP response found or something like this. Now for the else statement, if the response is null, we're going to do something response none. Now we have to decode the data, more specifically the JSON data. It is the response data, not the form data. It's a little bit confusing, but the response data. We can add here response data in order to make it more explicit. I think it's better. If data is not null, we're going to get the JSON representation by serializing by doing let JSON. I'm going to store it here under JSON value. And in Swift, if you're not interested in the try catch, you can do try. If it's successful, it's going to give non-nullable value. If it fails to decode or to serialize the JSON, it's going to give us a null value. That's why we have done this guard statement. To convert the data to JSON, we're going to do here JSON, serialization, JSON objects with passing the data, of course, response data as an argument. For the option, we don't care actually about the options, just an empty array. All right, in this case, what we have to do here, I'm going to print the body JSON. else, let's try to do this string representation of this JSON response. We can do it by storing the response string, print, for example, the string representation. And of course, this is a good idea to add line break. If we are not able to show the JSON nor the response body, we're going to print something, for example, response body enable to decode the data. And if the data is null, no data. All right, we are done with this particular section, and we have to show the error. And again, the error from calling from the URL session.data. It is a shortcut. It's the same thing as doing this one, this kind of syntax, but for shortcuts, we can do this. If let's error, we're going to print here the error. And more specifically, we're going to print the localized description. Now we have to come back to the API service to use the API service logger as well as the API error. If the URL, if we are not able to construct the URL or there is an invalid URL, we're going to throw, you guessed it, API error of type invalid URL. Now we need to show the logger, and let's make it optional. Therefore, I'm going to create here a private field with logger. By default, it's going to be false. If with logger, what we have to do here is to do API service logger log. Let's pass the request, which is the request that we have constructed before, and we have the response, and we have the data. If it's not a success status, we're going to throw an API error of type, I think it's going to be invalid response. We need to throw another exception, API error, and we have to pass here the request failed. As an argument, we need to pass the error from the exception, all right, from the catch block. Now let's start implementing the first public function, which is the get method. It has to take in the parameter type t of type codable. We're going to see if we ever need to conform to the protocol sendable. And of course, we have to pass here in parameter the endpoint, because in this get function, we're going to use the make request. It's going to give us a value of type t, generic type. We need to pass here the type. You can directly call the make request, but we're going to surround this block with do catch. If we have an error, here it's going to be of type decoding failed. Basically, we're going to decode the DTO. We're going to store the data by calling try, await, make request, the API endpoint. The method here, it's going to be a get method, the base URL, either from the class or from the function, and the headers from the function. Now we have to decode basically this response. And if you do remember, we have implemented the normal get that has to be inferred from the API response or the other one, which is the raw response. Therefore, let's create here the API response under API package. It is basically a normal DTO. Let's call it API response, and it has to be generic. By providing a type T, codable first of all, it's going to be representing the DTO, and the whole class should be codable. It has only one field, which is the data of type T. Now we have to decode by doing JSON decoder and decode for the type, which is basically the API response. And we have to provide here the parameter of type T from the function get. And we have to do here self. And from basically the data that we have obtained from calling the make request. We need to return the decoded response and data. And data basically, it is the field of API response. As simple as this. Now let's define the other function, which is the raw get. I'm going to copy this, but here instead of decoding the API response, I'm going to delete this. We will simply return try JSON decoder decode of this type that we have called it off and the data as an argument here. And with the same manner, we're going to define raw post and the post. It's the same implementation here, raw post. Now let's add the other version. And finally, the put method. Now we are ready to add the API service builder that's going to build for us the instance of API service. It's going to be used basically in the dependency injection. It's going to follow basically the builder pattern. From the API service, we can infer the needed private fields or the fields of this particular class. We need basically the base URL, the timeout, and whether it's going to support logger or to show the login messages for debugging and the session to be used, and whether we are running the task under background thread or foreground thread. And we have the default session from URL session and shared. Because in other videos, we're going to mock basically the API service and we have to provide another session for testing. You know the drill by now. We have to do the functions that's going to assign different fields. It starts by base URL. You have to provide here the string URL. It's going to give us an API service builder. Let's assign the base URL to string URL and we have to return self. Likewise, for timeout and the rest of the fields, by doing this, it's going to be very readable in our code, which is very professional, to be honest. I like using builder pattern. Now let's define the function that's going to build for us this instance to return an API service, and we have to fill in the blanks. And that's pretty much it for the API service builder. And we need to add here basically a public initializer, and that's all we have. One last thing here to add before ending the video is the resource. If you do remember, under Kotlin, we have the resource class that we have used in the network bound resource. This is my take on it. I guess it's a good idea to use here enum, because under Swift, we don't have sealed class. Therefore, we're going to use here enum, and we have to specify the needed cases. We have an empty case, the loading state, and the loading state we have the data of type T. The other case, which is success state, you have to provide here the data as well of type T, and the error state, the data which is nullable, and here in loading, I guess it should be nullable as well. Under error, we have to provide the data which is nullable as well as the error nullable as well. I would like to add here a public computed property for the data. It's going to return basically the data if it's available. I'm going to switch on self. I'm going to group actually the error as well as the loading under the same case. All right, for the empty, it's going to be null. For the loading, it's going to be data. Success, it's going to be data. Let's get the error, a computed property for the error. We're not interested here in the data, but we do need the error instead. In this case, what we have to do here is to return the error. And by default, it's going to be null. I would like to add here 3 computed properties to check if we are under error state or loading state or empty state. Basically, it's going to be more readable instead of comparing and make the comparison ourselves. We're going to do it as computed properties. I'm going to define the first one, and the rest is going to be similar. Let's do, for example, is empty. If case, if it is an empty, we're going to return here true. Otherwise, false. The same goes for is loading, for success, and for error. This is going to be basically useful in testing. And that's all we have for the package API. And I think that's pretty much it for today's video. For the next video, I'm going to implement the crypto service. I hope you liked the video. See you in the next one, and happy coding.